asking, is Liz Truss the worst Prime Minister ever? 0207.
Should we say yes and just move on?
Oh, no. Lots of people disagree, and there's plenty of other people that could take that title. Yes, indeed. We'd love your thoughts on this. Maybe you'd have another suggestion or an alternative. So in an interview with a local paper, she insisted that she wasn't the worst, surprise, surprise. Instead, she claimed that Tony Blair should take that title. Now, Liz Truss was Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister. I'm not sure she could deny that, just spending 49 days in office. And during that time, she oversaw the mini-budget in 2022 that sent the markets into freefall and mortgage rates through the roof. So she says she wasn't the worst. But you say she was, Lowri?
Well, I mean, she did crash the economy, didn't she? And for anybody who has to pay a mortgage now, you know, they would definitely say she was the worst. I mean, there'd been Boris Johnson and the parties in Downing Street, that was pretty appalling, wasn't it? I mean, personally, I found David Cameron incredibly irritating, both kind of really dull and loved to kind of lecture. It was just Mr. Lovely Perfect. You know, left his children behind in the pub, didn't he? With at least one. But, you know,
that was just one and he forgot. And
well,
we've had 57...
So boring, very boring.
57 Prime Ministers since Robert Walpole I in 1721. And I think we've had 5 in the last 8 years. And I think you named Cameron... Johnson and her, and I think they're 3 pretty bad ones. I wouldn't put. I think Sunak's better. I think he's not very good at politics.
Why Theresa May?
Because he called a referendum he never wanted, and he didn't have to call, and he did it for tactical reasons, and he lost Europe. But there's been some real rummins in history. Like on Labour's side, Jim Callaghan, 76 to 79, wasn't very good. Not as bad as Truss, Cameron, or Johnson. Then we used to have Neville Chamberlain, ahead of the Second World War, handled that incredibly badly.
What about after the Second World War? You're
not saying Thatcher. Anthony.
Well, I disagree with Thatcher on so many areas, and it's just a swear word in our house still. But I wouldn't say she was a terrible Prime Minister because she knew what she wanted to do it and kind of did it quite well in her way, despite the fact
that's interesting.
Despite the fact I detest her. The Second World War, Anthony Eden, what, 57?
The Suez Canal.
55 to 57, yeah. I mean, that was terrible. But there were some real rummins in, like, Wellington when he was after Waterloo. He was a terrible Prime Minister because he was so conservative against reform. There was Lord North who lost the colonies, North America.
And you thought it was just going to be an easy debate.
I'm sorry.
I think it's interesting that Liz Truss had chosen Tony Blair. I mean, obviously, he's very... the whole, Iraq...
and Afghanistan, I think, were big mistakes. Big, terrible mistakes.
But the economy was good under Tony Blair, and he did a lot in Northern Ireland, so does that balance itself out?
I think it's interesting when you look back, you have obviously a very different opinion in retrospect than you have at the time. I was watching something and they had some film of Barack Obama, and you suddenly remembered, wow, he was so kind of elegant and beautifully, the way he expressed himself. And at the time, I thought, oh, my goodness. So I think that it's difficult, isn't it? Because at the time... Thatcher was kind of terrible, but I now look back and think, but goodness me, she managed to do it. I mean, she managed to, become Prime Minister as a woman, and she faced all, terrible kind of sexism and stuff. So it's difficult.
That's interesting because a lot of people would feel differently about Thatcher, that they might actually think she was quite good at the time, allowing people to buy their council houses, allowing people to get that foot up. Now we look at the housing crisis and we look back at Thatcher and think, well, maybe those policies weren't that great.
Privatisation, including water and power, we're paying for now, communities lost manufacturing jobs because she allowed the pound to surge when she put up inflation rates, and manufacturing was absolutely hammered. Now, I think she had a record I would really hammer, but for incompetence and ineptness, you'd have, she wasn't Johnson, Truss or Cameron.
Yeah. Who, if you could only give one the title, who would you give it to?
The worst.
The worst.
I might give it to Cameron for his Brexit referendum, which is a recurring, it's £100 billion hit on the economy. I know people voted for it. They wanted their extra £350 million a week for the NHS, which never existed and they'll never get, and lots of other reasons. But most people who support Brexit have gone quiet. But he called that referendum, wanting to win it, for tactical reasons.
He also gave Scotland their own referendum as well. Isn't that a good thing, to give people a voice, to give people a vote in something that's incredibly important? Whether that turned out to be right or wrong may be irrelevant.
Yeah, it's why do you pick what your referendums or for. Now, I could see setting up the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly as was Senate as it is now, independent Scotland wants it, yes. But Brexit was one of those issues that was never suitable for a referendum because it is so complex and people voted for all different, different reasons. And that's not to say I'm not talking people down. No. But it is.
You are.
You didn't have. Did you know what the Brexit deal was?
Well,
no, you didn't. No, you didn't.
No, because
you didn't know what it was at the time. So
yeah.
what were you signing up for?
Are we going to rehearse this all over again?
But you've just said I'm not calling people stupid. But you didn't know. You didn't know what you were voting for because you hadn't got the deal.
OK, let's go to the phones and see if we can come up with any other names. Dave from Manchester, what's your thoughts? Is Liz Truss the worst Prime Minister?
Well, I think there's a number that are right up there. I mean, you've got to think of Johnson. I think with Cameron, I think with Brexit, he got overconfident when just before he kept the United Kingdom together with the Scottish vote. But I would go well before then, with Macmillan. Here's the man that said perhaps one of the most inappropriate slogans, "You've never had it so good." And I think a lot of historians say Macmillan was, and his government were utterly incompetent. As a child, I remember during and then directly after the credit squeezes. Everybody was talking about the negativity of the then balance of payments, and also Thatcher, her policy. I had some friends that bought their own council house with a mortgage, and they were singing her praises in mid-1980s. By the time she left and Major was in, they were complaining about her because of the rise of the mortgage rates.
Dave, I'm not going to make the case for Macmillan, but just to make the case for him not being the worst. Well, he was 1957 to 63. He had a fantastic record on house building, including council houses. Shouldn't he get a tick for that?
Well, I think that was really down to the local councils. And indeed, there was some clearance, but there were a lot of wrongs in that. There were a lot of communities that were ripped up during that time, and he should have done. Look at the benefit of hindsight. There should have been renovation, and we wouldn't have had the housing crisis of today if those small little two up, two downs were still there and extended with internal bathrooms,
It's an interesting theory that we wouldn't have the housing crisis that we have today. I think we've just got a lot more people that need houses and we're not building any at all. And it's interesting that you give kudos to the councils. Maybe it's the council's fault that we're not building enough now. I don't know. But it's an interesting theory there where you're looking at Macmillan and you're seeing all his bad points and his good, and you're trying to balance that out.
Yeah.
Do you think that works for every Prime Minister, or do you think that just some things that they do far outweigh any good that they could possibly do? Liz Truss, for example, just crashing the economy within 49 days. Would she ever have got, redeemed herself from that?
If she lasted longer than 7 weeks, 49 days, I don't feel she would, because she was all about crash and burn, and she just never really had the plot. I think just watching her in those leadership debates, I thought, oh no, please. You see her now, and she looks completely gone. You think she's got a shopping trolley outside with all her belongings.
It does feel like she's doing an impression of herself.
At the time, I do remember being very annoyed that it was the people trading shares, for example, or buying or selling, in the City of London, who decided that she should no longer be Prime Minister. And I kind of thought, hang on, that's not very democratic. If it had been a very left-wing person who'd come in and announce their plans, and the City had done the same, there'd be an outcry. How dare the City of London,
but remember, she sidelined the Treasury, she sidelined the Bank of England, the watchdog, the Office of Budget Responsibility.
She didn't get it stress tested before she did it. That was her massive mistake.
Yeah.
Dave, thank you very much for your call. John from Wiltshire, who do you think the worst Prime Minister of all time is?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Liz Truss was bad, but you have got no one worse than Boris Johnson.
Tell me why.
The man lied to us from his first day in Parliament as Prime Minister. He crashed our economy, and I don't care what you say about Truss doing it. He crashed our economy. He made the country a laughingstock, and either indirectly or directly, he caused the death of thousands of people in nursing homes. The man is a criminal, he's a liar, and he ought to be facing a jail sentence. OK,
I'm going to do the unenviable job. I'm going to defend Boris Johnson. He had to tackle a pandemic, something that no other Prime Minister had to do before. So he was in uncharted territory. He got COVID himself and became incredibly ill. He...
Allegedly.
Allegedly he got ill. That's a bit of a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
I think he definitely got ill. He was shaking all those hands, remember? In fact, it'd be quite strange if you were shaking all those hands at that time and didn't fall ill. In fact, so is there something to be said for that? He got Brexit done, and people would credit him with that. The vaccine rollout?
No, he didn't do all of that.
Well,
he didn't get Brexit done.
Well, he got a deal
because he'd already. And look what it's done to the country. We should never have been in that position, because if we'd been told the truth, we would never have come out.
OK. John, I don't think I did much then to defend Boris Johnson there. Thank you very much for your call. Nobody brought up Partygate, did we?
There's so many candidates, aren't there, really?
There are quite a few. But interestingly, most of them modern. And most of them, when I look, conservative.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say, apart from Tony Blair, who is the more right of...
In truth, there's only been 6 Labour Prime Ministers in history, so they haven't got very since 1900, right, since the party was formed. And the Conservatives had 5 in the last 8 years, so they got more contenders. But I think with Johnson is, I agree on Brexit, because he never had his oven-ready deal and he did a terrible, terrible deal. But I think it's that lying, repeatedly lying. And COVID would have been very difficult for any Prime Minister to cope with. But if you've got somebody who doesn't get on top of the detail, doesn't really care about facts, and then he's not straight with you, and his ministers aren't straight with you, including Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, because the Prime Minister's not straight, then people like John feel very, very aggrieved.
But when you talk about a Prime Minister that lies... that seems to be quite a common trait, is it not, amongst Prime Ministers? Or do you think Boris Johnson sort of...
I think he took it to a new level.
Yeah. OK.
I think that's what he did.
Fine. Anne from Hertfordshire, what's your view when it comes to the worst Prime Minister we've ever had? Who is it?
I think the worst Prime Minister we have ever had is the one that has gone on a couple of weeks' leave. So, our present Prime Minister is the worst one we've ever had.
It's the worst...
I think it's the worst. I don't think she was given enough time to improve anything. The politicians didn't like her from the get-go.
So you would have rather had Liz Truss in this whole time than Rishi Sunak?
I'd like to give her a bit more time to see what she was made of.
What was your objection to Rishi Sunak then?
I think he's just looking after his rich friends. He don't care about any of the rest of us.
So you don't think he's trying
this country's going to go bankrupt if he stays.
OK, so there's a general election, so you'll get an opportunity to vote for change very, very soon.
Will.
But you think that Rishi Sunak is worse than Liz Truss, worse than Boris Johnson, worse than Margaret Thatcher, worse than all the Prime Ministers in history? Interesting.
He's bringing the country to its knees. The NHS is falling apart. The schools are falling apart. Everything's on its knees now, and he's to blame for it. OK,
Anne, thank you very much for your call. I wonder whether we judge modern PMs more harshly than we do those in history because we have to live it with them.
I think that's true. I think you know them. It's like if you say who's the greatest football player for your team, you often get fans or somebody who's played recently rather than going back. It's because you know them and you experience them and they're fresh. I think that's one of the reasons. But I do think we have had a rum bunch very recently. It's been
torrid, hasn't it? It really has.
Yeah, I'll leave Theresa May out. I think she believed in public service. I don't think she was very, very good. I disagree with that, and I don't think Sunak, who I'm not a natural fan of his, wouldn't normally defend him, but I don't think it's as bad as the 3 others.
I was actually quite surprised that he got a vote there for that. John from Nottingham, what's your view when it comes to the worst Prime Minister ever?
Tony Blair, without doubt.
OK, so that's who Liz Truss would vote, but why would you vote him for the worst Prime Minister?
Well, the man's a war criminal to start with. Why did he go to war in Afghanistan?
Well, he thought there was weapons of mass destruction.
Well, even the village idiot knew there wasn't weapons of mass destruction. So he's not only a war criminal, he's an idiot.
And what about all the good that he did, though, for the economy? What about, you know, the Good Friday Agreement? What about, you know, can we balance that at all, or just taking the country to war is...
What did he do for the economy?
Well, the economy went up on average, I think, 2.3% every year, whereas under the current government, I think...
Excuse me, but his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, sold the gold off for £2.40 an ounce.
Oh dear, the minute I hear the gold argument, I think, look, you've got to look, right, that was invested, some of it, in other foreign currencies which went up in value, and you've got to look at the economy over the entire period, and it did well. It did better during those Labour years, including the financial collapse, the global financial collapse, which was on Labour's watch. It did better under all those Labour years that it's done since in the Conservative years, John. I agree with you about Afghanistan and Iraq. I think they were terrible, terrible mistakes. And he's got to shoulder the burden.
Gordon Brown's interesting, isn't he? Because at the time I thought he was just such an odd person, wasn't he? He was, and yet in retrospect, you know, here's a person who hasn't gone off and feathered his own nest. He's not buying country piles. He's not setting up foundations. You know, he's actually a good guy, I think. Yeah,
they revived the NHS, John, and they left office with the lowest waiting lists and the highest patient satisfaction.
But there was no money left, wasn't there?
No, there is no money. It was a joke note from one politician to his mate who was a Tory, but then his mate who was a Tory didn't get it. They put somebody else in, a Lib Dem, who then made it public, and so it ceased to be a joke.
Just talking about Gordon Brown there, who was Chancellor under Tony Blair, wasn't there a bit of criticism of Gordon Brown's chancellorship that he used a lot of privately funded PFIs, investments, in order to help the hospitals and build infrastructure and things that were needed, but they were off the book, so it made the finances look not as bad as they were, so they handed over quite a bad
it was a Tory scheme. He inherited from the Tories, and I think it would have been better to have scrapped it rather than expand it. But there'll be people using very good hospitals and very good schools that were built with that scheme.
Ended up incredibly expensive, haven't they?
It would have been cheaper in the long run to do it directly, absolutely.
So that's 2 votes for Tony Blair then, yours, John, and Liz Truss's. Michael from Essex, what's your thoughts when it comes to the worst Prime Minister ever?
Yes, good morning to you. Well, I go back a little bit further than that, because as a child through the London Blitz, I was able to see quite a bit of the then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who we all loved at that time. Everybody loved Winston. I met with a few of my friends, a couple of twins actually, down in Millfield Avenue, and 5 doors up from their house was the committee rooms of a chap called Clement Attlee. And somebody came along, and I can't remember whether we got a threepenny bit or a silver sixpence to wave a flag when this guy came through. Well, he did come along, and he stopped and he spoke, and frankly, I didn't get on with him at all. I didn't like the man. OK,
so Clement Attlee just because you didn't like him?
No, because he was the first Labour Prime Minister after the war, and from that point on, we seemed to go down the tubes.
What about, Mike, I'm sorry, just to counter that, I can see why you don't like that's fine, Major Attlee, you know, served in the First World War, but he did create the NHS, the modern welfare state, demobilised hundreds of thousands of service personnel without unemployment going up. They got jobs, he built houses. You may not agree with the nationalisation programme, but he's normally considered to be one of the most significant, arguably the greatest Prime Minister since the Second World War.
Well,
so I like your counter-argument.
Everybody was horrified when he walked into power.
They weren't horrified because they voted
because it was automatically assumed that Winston would get re-elected. And I've been looking at this situation, and in my opinion, if Rishi Sunak isn't very, very careful at this next election, the same fate that befell Winston Churchill will befall the Tories once again.
Well, I have to wait and see, but I wonder whether, you know, Winston Churchill was very well liked when he left, and maybe that was part of the problem, that nobody else was going to replace him with the same sort of...
No, you know what it was? It was people had won a victory, a great victory in the Second World War. With Churchill was a great figurehead. They didn't want a return to the poverty and the inequality and the hardship before the war, which they would have with Churchill. But Churchill was back as Prime Minister 6 years later in 1951.
So Rishi could return.
Michael, thank you very much for your call. Thanks for all your calls on this. We are going to have to move on.